Imagine the ultimate sanctuary, a private getaway where the world disappears and your only job is to breathe. But what if the walls have eyes and the silence isn't empty but expectant? You think you're alone in that rented bedroom, safe behind a locked door, but the lens is already watching. Tonight, we dive into a chilling reality where your vacation dream becomes a voyeuristic nightmare you can't wake up from. Mark and Sarah were desperate for an escape from the suffocating routine of their corporate lives in London, seeking solace in the sun-drenched, cobblestone streets of Lisbon. They spent weeks scouring rental platforms until they found it, a penthouse apartment that seemed too good to be true, boasting vintage wooden beams and a panoramic view of the Atlantic. The listing was perfect, the reviews were glowing, and the price was a steal for such luxury. They arrived late on a Tuesday, exhausted but exhilarated by the crisp salt air and the promise of a week where the only thing on their schedule was each other. Little did they know, their sanctuary was designed not for comfort, but for the meticulous, silent observation of their most private moments. The host, a man named Elias, who communicated only through cryptic yet polite text messages, had left the key in a weathered copper lockbox hidden behind a potted fern. As the heavy oak door groaned open, the apartment greeted them with a scent of lavender and ancient dust. Everything looked exactly like the digital photos, yet there was a peculiar density to the air that Sarah noticed immediately, a feeling of being a guest in a space that hadn't quite let go of its previous inhabitants. They laughed off the mild unease, attributing it to the jet lag and the strange shadows cast by the flickering street lamps outside. They unpacked their bags, poured 2 glasses of local wine, and toasted to a week of absolute, uninterrupted privacy. That first night was supposed to be a deep, restorative sleep, but the silence of the apartment felt heavy, almost performative. Every few minutes, a floorboard would creak in the hallway, or a radiator would hiss with a sound like a muffled intake of breath. Mark slept soundly, his rhythmic breathing the only anchor in the dark. But Sarah lay awake, her eyes tracing the contours of the ceiling fans and the heavy velvet curtains. She felt a phantom itch on her skin, that primal mammalian instinct that signals when a predator is nearby, even when the logic of the modern world insists you're safe behind 3 deadbolts. She eventually drifted off, unaware that the darkness in the corner of the room was far more attentive than she could imagine. Morning brought the blinding clarity of the Portuguese sun, and with it, the anxieties of the night seemed foolish and childish. They spent the second day wandering through the Alfama district, getting lost in the labyrinthine alleys and eating custard tarts until they felt sick with joy. Mark took photos of Sarah against the blue-tiled walls, her smile radiant and genuine, a stark contrast to the growing, unspoken tension that began to brew within the apartment's walls. Even as they enjoyed the vibrant culture, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, not by a person on the street, but by the lingering memory of the apartment's stillness. It was as if the building itself was memorizing their faces and their habits. When they returned that evening, a strange detail caught Sarah's eye. The small silver jewelry box she had left on the nightstand was turned exactly 45 degrees from where she remembered placing it. She mentioned it to Mark, who was busy uncorking a bottle of wine, and he chuckled, suggesting she was just being paranoid or that the vibrations from the nearby tram had shifted it. He kissed her forehead, telling her to relax and enjoy the vacation she had worked so hard to afford. They watched a movie on a laptop, huddled together under a knitted throw, completely oblivious to the fact that their every word and gesture was being digitized and stored. The apartment was no longer just a rental, it was a stage. On the third morning, the atmospheric tension finally broke into a tangible discovery that would shatter their sense of reality forever. Mark was searching for his phone charger, which had mysteriously vanished from the bedside table, and he began crawling on his hands and knees to peer into the dark crevices between the furniture. As he reached behind the heavy, ornate wooden headboard, his fingers brushed against something cold and plastic, a small rectangular device tethered to a thin wire that ran directly into the wall socket. With a frown of confusion, he pulled it out, expecting a rogue power adapter. But what he found was a sleek, high-definition lens disguised as a generic USB wall charger. His heart skipped a beat as the realization washed over him. Sarah walked into the room to find Mark staring at the device with a face drained of all color, his hands trembling slightly as he pointed out the tiny pinhole aperture of the camera. The device was positioned at the perfect angle to capture the entire bed, the bathroom door, and the vanity mirror, leaving absolutely no corner of their private life unexposed. The violation felt physical, a violent intrusion that turned their romantic getaway into a digital fishbowl. Panic surged through them as they frantically began to sweep the rest of the apartment, looking for more eyes hidden in plain sight. They found a second camera embedded in the smoke detector in the living room, and a third one cleverly concealed within a speaker. The sheer scale of the surveillance suggested something far more sinister than a simple pervert. It was a professional installation, a web of observation that turned the entire penthouse into a high-tech surveillance suite. Mark, driven by a cocktail of rage and terror, managed to prise the SD card out of the bedroom camera using a small pocket knife. They sat on the edge of the bed, the very bed that had been watched for 3 nights, and inserted the card into Mark's laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a long list of video files, each time-stamped with meticulous precision. Their hands shook as they clicked on the first file, seeing themselves laughing and drinking wine from the night before, their intimate moments played back in chilling resolution. As they scrolled through the footage, the initial shock gave way to a deeper, more visceral horror that made their stomachs churn with nausea. Most of the clips were exactly what they expected: mundane glimpses of their vacation, conversations about dinner plans, and the quiet moments of their morning routine. However, as Mark scrolled down to the folders from the previous night, he noticed a series of files that were recorded between 2 and 4 in the morning, the hours when they were both deeply asleep. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the mousepad, a heavy sense of foreboding filling the room like a thick fog. Sarah gripped his arm, her knuckles white, her breath hitching in her throat as she whispered. The video opened with a grainy, night vision view of the bedroom, the green-tinted frames showing Mark and Sarah tangled in the sheets, completely oblivious to the world around them. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of their chests as they breathed in unison. Then, the bedroom door, which they specifically remembered locking before going to sleep, began to swing open with agonizing slowness. It didn't creak or groan. It moved with the practiced ease of a door that had been oiled specifically for a silent entrance. A tall, slender silhouette stepped into the room, pausing for a long moment in the doorway to observe the couple before gliding toward the foot of the bed. The figure was dressed in dark, form-fitting clothing and wore a thin, translucent mask that distorted their facial features into a blank, porcelain-like void. They didn't move like a burglar looking for valuables. They moved like a scientist observing a specimen, or a lover admiring a partner. The intruder stood at the edge of the bed for nearly 20 minutes, leaning down so close to Sarah's face that their breath must have been felt on her skin. In the video, Sarah shifted slightly in her sleep, and the intruder froze instantly, turning into a statue of shadow until she settled back into a deep slumber. The level of comfort the person felt in the space was terrifying, suggesting this wasn't their first visit. The intruder eventually reached out a gloved hand and gently stroked the hair away from Sarah's forehead, a gesture so intimate and chilling that Mark let out a strangled sob of fury and fear. The person then turned toward the camera, almost as if they knew they were being recorded, and leaned in until the distorted mask filled the entire frame. They didn't say a word, but they held a small Polaroid photograph up to the lens, a photo of Mark and Sarah, taken from the street the day before while they were eating lunch in the Alfama district. This meant they hadn't just been watched inside the house. They had been hunted through the city, tracked by a shadow that was now back. Just as the intruder in the video began to reach under the bed to pull out a long metallic object that glinted in the infrared light, the laptop screen suddenly went black. A notification popped up in the corner of the display, indicating that the file was corrupted or that the connection to the external storage had been severed. Mark frantically tapped at the keys, trying to reboot the media player, but a sudden, loud thud resonated from the hallway outside their bedroom door. It wasn't the sound of a house settling. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy boot hitting the floorboards, followed by the slow, rhythmic turning of the doorknob. They looked at the door, realizing the recording wasn't just history. The metallic click of the doorknob echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the room. Mark felt the blood drain from his face, his heart hammering as if trying to burst through his chest. Sarah's grip on his arm was so tight, her knuckles were white, her breath hitching in a way that sounded like a sob. They both stared at the wooden door, watching the brass handle slowly rotate downward with agonizing deliberation. The intruder wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. This was a calculated move, a psychological game designed to savor the terror radiating from within the bedroom. The floorboards outside groaned under a heavy weight, suggesting that whoever stood there was leaning their full mass against the frame. Time seemed to distort, stretching every second into a grueling eternity as the handle reached its maximum rotation. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the movement had been, a thick, heavy void that swallowed their rational thoughts. Mark's mind raced through every possible scenario, wondering if he should charge the door or search for a weapon as the laptop screen remained black. He remembered the heavy glass carafe on the nightstand, its weight a meager defense against a masked figure carrying a metallic object. He slowly reached out, his fingers trembling, and felt the cold surface of the glass. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for the violent burst of energy that would surely come. Suddenly, the pressure on the doorknob vanished. They heard the slow, retreating rhythm of footsteps moving back toward the living room, each step deliberate and heavy. It wasn't a retreat of fear, but a predator giving its prey a momentary illusion of safety. Mark and Sarah shared a look of pure, unadulterated dread, realizing they were trapped in a vertical labyrinth 3 stories above the cobblestone streets of Lisbon. Mark whispered for Sarah to stay put while he approached the door, his feet barely touching the floor to avoid making a sound. He pressed his ear against the wood, hearing nothing but the distant hum of the city and the frantic thumping of his own pulse. The apartment had become a cage, and the hunter was waiting. He carefully locked the door from the inside, though he knew the flimsy mechanism offered little protection against a determined intruder. Sarah fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking so violently that she almost dropped it. When the screen illuminated her pale face, she gasped in frustration. There were no bars, no signal at all, not even for emergency calls. Mark checked his own phone and found the same result, a dead zone that hadn't existed just an hour ago. It became clear that the intruder wasn't just a random prowler. They were equipped with a signal jammer, a sophisticated piece of technology designed to isolate them completely. They were officially off the grid, buried alive in a beautiful apartment that now felt like a tomb. Desperation began to set in as they realized the full scale of their isolation. Mark moved toward the large, ornate window that overlooked the narrow alleyway, hoping to catch the attention of a late-night passerby. He gripped the heavy wooden shutters and tried to pull them open, but they wouldn't budge. Upon closer inspection, he saw that long, industrial-grade screws had been driven through the frames into the stone walls, disguised by a layer of fresh paint that matched the wood. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a temporary security measure. The apartment had been modified into a high-tech hunting ground, a place where guests were welcomed, only to be sealed inside once the sun went down and the doors were locked. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, landing on the walk-in closet they had used to store their suitcases. She remembered a strange draft coming from the back wall when she had hung up her dresses on the first day. With a newfound sense of urgency, she gestured for Mark to follow her. They stepped into the cramped space, the scent of cedar and old dust filling their nostrils. Mark pushed aside the hanging clothes, feeling along the wallpaper for any inconsistencies. His hand brushed against a small, circular indentation hidden behind a coat hook. As he pressed it, a section of the wall clicked and shifted inward, revealing a narrow observation slit. He peered through it and felt a wave of nausea. It gave a perfect view. The observation slit was just the beginning. As Mark pushed the hidden panel further, it groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a dark, secondary corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway of the apartment. This was how the intruder had moved so silently, navigating through the bones of the building without ever being seen. The air coming from the passage was cold and smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. Sarah clung to Mark's shirt, her eyes wide with terror as she stared into the abyss of the secret hallway. They realized that the landlord, Mr. Silva, must have known about this. His helpful suggestions were likely just excuses to ensure they were settled for the night. They stood at the threshold of the secret passage, caught between the threat in the living room and the unknown horrors of the wall space. Mark knew they couldn't stay in the bedroom. It was a dead end. He reached into his suitcase and pulled out a heavy tactical flashlight he usually kept for hiking. He didn't turn it on yet, fearing the light would betray their position through the gaps in the floorboards. Instead, he took Sarah's hand and led her into the darkness of the hidden corridor. The floor here was made of rough-hewn stone, a remnant of the building's 18th century foundations. As they moved deeper, they found a small shelf carved into the wall. On it sat a collection of personal items, including several different wallets. Mark picked up one of the wallets, his hands trembling as he flipped it open. Inside was a driver's license belonging to a young woman from London, her smiling face a haunting contrast to the grim surroundings. There were dozens of credit cards and IDs from various countries, all belonging to people who had once stayed in this very Airbnb. The realization was sickening. They weren't just the latest victims of a voyeur, but part of a systematic operation that had been running for years. This apartment was a trap designed to harvest more than just memories. Every guest who checked in was carefully screened, tracked, and then brought back here to be processed. The corrupted file on the laptop wasn't a glitch, but a remote kill switch. A sudden sound from below made them freeze. It was the sound of a heavy door opening, followed by the murmur of multiple voices. The intruder wasn't alone. From their vantage point inside the wall, they could hear the distinct clinking of metal tools and the low, guttural laughter of men who sounded entirely too comfortable in the space. Mark realized with a jolt of horror that the apartment was actually a stage, and they were the unwilling performers for an audience they couldn't see. He leaned closer to a small vent near the floor, trying to get a glimpse of the living room. Through the slats, he saw 3 figures standing around the dining table. They were carefully laying out surgical instruments on the table. One of the men looked up, his face obscured by a silicone mask that mimicked the features of a generic man. He held up Sarah's smartphone and began scrolling through her photos with a casual indifference that was more terrifying than any overt threat. He stopped at a picture of her and Mark at the airport, laughing as they arrived in Lisbon. The man chuckled and showed the screen to his companions, who nodded in approval. Mark felt a surge of protective rage, but he knew that any outburst would mean their certain death. They had to find another way out. As they moved deeper, the wall behind them suddenly slid shut, and a voice whispered through a speaker, "Welcome to the final act." The voice through the speaker was a synthetic rasp, a manufactured chill that vibrated against the narrow plaster walls and sealed their fate with an audible click. Mark and Sarah stood paralyzed as the sliding panel behind them locked into place with a definitive mechanical finality. There was no handle, no latch, and no hope of prying it open with bare fingernails. The air in this hidden interstitial space was stale, heavy with the scent of old dust, ozone, and something metallic that suggested blood. Sarah gripped Mark's arm so hard her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in rhythmic, shallow stabs of panic. Above them, a dim red light flickered to life, illuminating a long, narrow corridor that stretched deep into the building's hidden skeleton. Every step they took deeper into the crawlspace felt like a descent into a mechanical throat. The walls were lined with bundles of black cables, pulsing with the silent data of a dozen other rooms being monitored simultaneously. They realized then that this wasn't just a single trap, but a central nervous system for an entire network of voyeuristic terror. Mark moved forward, his hand tracing the rough timber of the internal frame, until they reached a small landing. Through a gap in the floorboards, they could see into the room below, the very room they had just fled. The masked men were no longer standing around the table. They were moving with a surgical, practiced efficiency, preparing the space for what was clearly a ritual of extraction. At the end of the narrow passage, they stumbled into a room that defied the ancient architecture of the building. It was a high-tech nerve center, filled with glowing servers and a wall of monitors that displayed different apartments throughout the city. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the faces of other tourists, some sleeping, some showering, all oblivious to the digital eyes boring into their privacy. In the center of the desk sat a ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and prices. This was a marketplace where human experiences were sold to the highest bidder. The realization hit them with visceral force. They weren't just being watched for sport. They were inventory in a global trade of absolute, unconsented vulnerability. On the main monitor, Sarah saw a grid of faces, and her breath caught when she spotted her own profile highlighted in glowing amber. Beside her name was a countdown timer that had less than 5 minutes remaining. Below the timer, a chat box scrolled with lightning speed, filled with encrypted usernames bidding in a currency they didn't recognize. The comments were a nightmare of depravity, with strangers debating the merits of their fear and predicting their reactions to the final act. It became clear that the host was merely a facilitator for a much larger audience of monsters who watched from the safety of their own homes. The apartment was a theater, and the ticket prices were paid in blood and trauma. Suddenly, the muffled sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor they had just traversed. The intruders had realized they were no longer in the living room and were tracking them through the service tunnels. Mark scanned the control room frantically for a weapon, his eyes landing on a heavy metal server rack. He knew they couldn't outrun a coordinated team in their own maze. He grabbed a thick, coiled power cable and handed a heavy glass paperweight to Sarah. Their fear was being harvested for profit, but the rage began to boil over, replacing the paralyzing terror with a desperate, animalistic will to survive. They retreated into the shadows of the server racks, waiting for the first mask to emerge. The door at the far end of the server room hissed open, and the man in the silicone mask stepped inside, holding a long, slender blade that caught the blue light of the monitors. He moved with a terrifying rhythmic grace, as if he were performing a dance he had practiced 1,000 times before. He didn't call out or demand they surrender. He simply began to hum a low, dissonant tune that filled the cramped space with an unbearable sense of dread. Mark watched the man's shadow stretch across the floor, timing his heartbeats to the intruder's footsteps. Just as the man turned the corner of the rack, Mark lunged, swinging the server chassis with every ounce of his remaining strength. The impact was a sickening crunch of metal against bone. The man collapsed, but he didn't scream. He only let out a wet, raspy groan as he tried to claw at Mark's legs. Sarah didn't hesitate, bringing the heavy glass down with a scream of her own, striking until the figure stopped moving. They didn't stay to check his pulse. They scrambled over his body and through the open door, finding themselves in a service elevator that smelled of industrial cleaner and rot. Mark slammed the buttons, his fingers slick with sweat and the intruder's blood. The lift groaned to life, descending not to the lobby, but deeper into the bowels of the old Gothic building, where the secrets were buried. The elevator doors opened into a cavernous basement filled with rows of suitcases, shoes, and discarded cameras. It was a graveyard of previous guests, a physical manifestation of the digital ledger they had seen upstairs. Hundreds of lives had ended here, or at least the versions of those lives that existed before they entered the apartment. Amidst the piles of luggage, Sarah saw a familiar red backpack, the one belonging to a girl they had seen in the elevator on their first day. The horror was no longer theoretical. It was tangible and overwhelming. They navigated the maze of belongings, heading toward a faint light at the end of a long, concrete tunnel that promised an exit to the street level. Just as they reached the heavy iron grate leading to the alleyway, a voice boomed over a speaker system, no longer synthetic, but dripping with a refined, aristocratic malice. The host informed them that their escape was also being filmed, a bonus feature for the premium subscribers who enjoyed the hunt more than the capture. The iron grate was locked, and from the shadows of the basement, 2 more masked figures emerged, blocking their path. Mark realized that every move they made was anticipated, choreographed by an entity that viewed their struggle as nothing more than a narrative arc. He looked at Sarah, and in that moment they shared a silent, grim understanding. They would not be another trophy in this room. Using a heavy iron pipe scavenged from the wall, Mark began to bash at the rusted hinges of the grate, while Sarah kept the intruders at bay with a makeshift torch made from a discarded silk scarf and a bottle of high-proof alcohol found in a suitcase. The fire flared up, a brilliant, hungry orange that momentarily blinded the men in the masks. The heat was intense, blistering the paint on the walls and filling the tunnel with thick, black smoke. With a final, desperate heave, the grate gave way, swinging open into the cool, midnight air of the Lisbon streets. They tumbled out onto the cobblestones, gasping for air that didn't taste of death, running toward the distant sirens of the city. The aftermath was a blur of police tape, cold interrogation rooms, and the frustrating realization that the host had vanished long before the authorities arrived. When the police searched the apartment, they found nothing but a standard, empty rental. The hidden walls were gone, the servers wiped, and the basement was nothing but a clean, empty storage space. The digital footprint of the livestream had evaporated into the dark web, leaving Mark and Sarah with nothing but their scars and a story that no one truly believed. They were alive, but the world felt different now. Every mirror felt like a window, and every shadow seemed to hold the faint red glow of a recording light that never truly turned off. In the end, the true horror of their experience wasn't the cameras or the masked men, but the knowledge that privacy is an illusion maintained by the mercy of strangers. Mark and Sarah returned home, but they never truly unpacked their bags, haunted by the realization that their most intimate moments are still being played on a loop for an audience that never sleeps. The final act wasn't their death, but the permanent loss of their peace of mind, a haunting that follows them into every hotel room and every rented home. Beware the places that feel too perfect, for the walls have ears, the mirrors have eyes, and the host is always watching your every move.